Hey everyone, Social Solipsist here for another week of 52 and 52, and this week I am taking a look at Necropolis Brutal Edition, which is the newly updated version of Necropolis from Harebrained Schemes, which came out, I believe, a couple of months ago actually, to some fairly middling to negative reviews. Obviously, since I did not have it, I can't speak to the original version, but as far as I'm aware, it has gotten some significant improvements since the original release. This game was gifted to me by my lovely compatriot Jubbatron, whose channel you can check out in the links below. And he gifted it to me because it's got 4-player co-op. This is a game I had my eye on a little bit beforehand, but it wasn't something I was super eager about. But we had a grand old time playing it. Well, I say that, but we'll get into it a little bit. Necropolis is a dungeon crawler of sorts. It's in a third-person perspective and has a lot of, I don't want to say a homage because it's perhaps not that that far, but it mimics Dark Souls in many ways. The control scheme, the use of items, the things like that. And admittedly, it's not, it could hardly be called a ripoff. It's not trying to be Dark Souls, but it's definitely taking some significant influence in trying to draw some of the same player base, I suppose. So where do I start with this? I guess unlike Dark Souls, it's a little bit more simplistic. You start with one of two, I guess you could call them classes. Basically either a brute or like a big guy or a little guy or girl. You can actually change gender, which is kind of an odd place to put in the work. I mean, not that I'm going to complain, but you'll see when I start talking about the other places this game is wanting why that seems like an odd place to put in the extra work. So you pick up either the little guy or the big guy. The big guy does a roll instead of the dodge, and can take a few more hits and moves a little slower, I think. I'm not exactly sure. You are not dropped in with very much instruction. You're kind of just dropped into the world and it says, here you go. Here's the controls, figure the rest of it out yourself. And like I said, it is sort of a dungeon crawler, so you're essentially just going through, trying to find your way to the next level, so on and so forth. You start with your sword and board, you know, pretty much quite literally a board, and a crappy sword, and as you loot chests and kill enemies, you get weapon and shield drops. Occasionally, very occasionally, you'll get things like armor or very rarely a projectile weapon of some sort, usually a crossbow or something like that, if you even see one. To be perfectly honest, the spawn rates on the projectile weapons is incredibly low. You might as well just assume you won't see one every game you play. There are a couple of vendors that you'll see at the sort of the end of each level that vend various things. However, this game does have effectively permadeath. When you die, you lose everything. You are given a score based on basically how far you got, and you get a small amount of a special currency that does carry over between characters that you can use to buy a few things. You can either use it to open golden chests, to get gamble and see if you get a really good item out of it, or you can use it to buy things like tomes that allow you certain buffs for the duration that you hold the tome, either until you switch it out for another one or something like that, or until you die. The tomes don't equip. You can't equip a tome until you get to the end of the first level. There is a lot of RNG that goes into this game, not in the least of which is the game is procedurally generated. The first level, as far as I'm aware, the first level is always a sort of literal dungeon crawl, you know, just room by room going through trying to get to the end. There are a couple of other biomes that are not of that type, but it's a gamble, or it's totally up to RNG whether you get one of those other biomes or how that biome is formed. Again, the rooms are, you know, procedurally generated or supposedly so. Although I have had runs where the first 5 or 6 levels are all the dungeon type, and well, we'll get to that in a moment. Some of the biomes that were added, in fact, maybe all of the biomes that were added beyond the first one, they may all be new for the updated release. I'm not sure one way or another, but I guess we'll get into the graphics a little bit now, since it sort of flows in. The graphics are not bad. It's hard to talk about them because it's got some very good things and some very bad things going for it. The screenshots that are on Steam are actually not very representative of what the game looks like. It's not that it doesn't look like that. It's that they've done some manipulation to make the colors pop more than they do. I mean, you can see the footage here. You can see what it's like. You get a lot of gray mixed in with some you know, some pops of color, often in muted tones, and whether aesthetically that's pleasing to you one way or another, maybe your thing, may not be your thing. It sort of is for me, but it does get fairly boring fairly quickly. Not the reasons for that are mostly just because the levels are very sparsely populated. For the most part, they're either sparsely populated or so repetitive in their contents that it just all kind of turns into one blur of sameness, which leads to some other problems that I'll get into in a minute. The low poly style actually really appeals to me. As you can tell, you know, everything is rendered in a very low number of polygons, which, you know, really adds to the aesthetic, I think. It gives it a very distinctive aesthetic that's avoids doing, you know, pixel art or something like that, while still presumably making it easy for the designers to you know, make assets and things like that relatively quickly. Although, you know, I have minimal experience with game design. I can't speak to how much faster it would really be than a high poly design. But it is, again, aesthetically, it may please you, it may not, but it is there. Unfortunately, despite being fairly low poly and fairly, you know, not populated with a lot of stuff, the game runs pretty poorly. It's not that it drops below 60 that often, and it does have enough settings to let you, you know, tweak stuff so that you can get a consistent frame rate. But trying to run this game on high, not even like the ultra settings, not even the highest like rendering settings. If I try on the highest rendering settings, my fairly beefy but slightly old computer does not even hit in the 40s. If I set it to high, which I think it was the default, it drops into the 50s and 40s fairly frequently. So I have it running sort of at medium, for better or for worse. It doesn't have a huge amount of effect on graphically, but performance-wise it does. It's sort of unclear to me why performance-wise it behaves so poorly. Although we did speculate while we were playing it co-op, that it appears that when you go down or up or down a level, that the game may keep the other levels completely rendered, because you can look up as you go down one of the elevators between the floors, and you can see the whole floor plan of the previous or the next level rendered above or below you. It's unclear how much. I mean, presumably they did some to negate that performance, the performance hit there. I would think at the very least they would turn off some of the effects and stuff so that that didn't constantly have to be rendering in the background. But to be perfectly honest, I don't know, and that's my best guess as to part of the reason why the performance is not what it ought to be. Getting into some design issues. We had a pretty good time playing it. It has up to 4-player co-op if you so choose. I did try playing single player, and to be honest, I was not. I mean, I played the first time I played it 3-player co-op with Jubba and another friend of ours, and we had a pretty good time with it despite its number of flaws. That said, playing it single player versus multiplayer is kind of a completely different experience, in that it's not a different experience at all. I will explain how that makes sense. As far as we can tell, the game doesn't change anything when you put in multiple players. It doesn't scale difficulty, it doesn't scale the number of enemies that spawn, it doesn't do anything of the sort. So the game single player can be very, very punishing, and when you drop in multiple players, it gets a heck of a lot easier when you have the ability to divide and conquer. On the other hand, in many ways, the multiplayer seems to have been put in as a bit of an afterthought. It's not that it's outright broken or anything like that. It actually handles fairly well. But there's just some design things where you would expect there to be design, and there isn't any. There's no way to join, as far as I'm aware, there's no way to join a game that isn't with friends. You have to invite people directly to your game or join directly into other people's games. There's no sort of pair with randoms type of thing or anything like that. There is also friendly fire, which may or may not be a conscious design decision, but it can get pretty frustrating, or pretty hilarious. I mean, the three of us are all pretty forgiving, fun-loving people, and we're never yelling at each other when one of us hits the other. But that could be looked at one way or another. And when you get later in the game, and you get some of the more powerful and larger weapons with giant sweeping arcs, you basically have to tackle an entirely different room if you don't want to hit your buddies. Either that, or you have to hope that they've got their shield up, so that when they do get hit, they don't take damage from it. What else? There's some notable things that I think the game really ought to have that it is missing, not the least of which is a map. And while admittedly there could be a fairly good or at least viable argument towards not having a map, that being, you know, oh, it's a dungeon that you're supposed to escape, you know, it's supposed to be sort of the sense of urgency, the sense of being lost would be lost to the game if there was a map. But because it's procedurally generated, and sometimes the maps can get very, very large, especially with multiple players, it can get very frustrating. Not only trying to find the exit, but trying to find your friends, because it's a maze. The maps are not linear. We had in our most recent run where we actually beat the game. Yes, we did beat the game. We got to the final level and beat it. We spent probably 2 hours on a single level, partially due to some hijinks, but the majority of the reason was just because we could not find the way out. We kept retracing our steps, not knowing where we had and hadn't been. And that can get awfully frustrating. It's one thing when you're stuck in a world like Dark Souls where every inch of it is populated with something. And you know that the reason you can't find your way is because, you haven't searched that area yet or something like that. But when it's just samey walls after samey walls after samey walls, or loops of, a looping route that you keep going through 10 times, not being able to find anything else, it can get pretty boring and pretty frustrating, and just lacks fun. Design-wise, again, I think it really does benefit from multiplayer. Not only because I tend to think a lot of games are more fun co-op, but just because there are certain things that are easier to accomplish. Not the least of which is giant rooms of dozens of swarming enemies, where in the single player aggro range, again, comparing it to Dark Souls perhaps unfairly, aggro range is fairly easy to get a handle on. It's fairly intuitive. You don't get it immediately, but fairly quickly you pick up, this is how far I can get away from certain enemies before they aggro. Whereas in this game, it feels very imprecise. You may aggro an entire room, you may aggro one guy. And if you aggro an entire room in the single player, in anything other than pretty much the first level, you are going to have to use the verticality of the level or some such thing similar to that to your advantage, basically to cheese it out. And having to cheese your way through every room, every major combat, is not very much fun. Admittedly, the multiplayer is still cheesing it, but you cheese it in different ways. Mostly where one person kind of kites the enemy while others whack at them, or you divide and conquer, as I mentioned before. It does have some depth in terms of the items and crafting and things like that. Basically, minor drops that you get from enemies can be crafted into various potions that do various things. But the process for getting the recipes to do so, or even for identifying certain items that you pick up off the ground, can be fairly frustrating. Not only because it's done somewhat archaically, similar to something like Diablo, where you have to identify stuff that you have just picked up. But on top of that fact, the system for identification or for learning new things is not the most intuitive to begin with, which just can make it feel like a slog more than anything else. What else can I say about it? I'm sure that I'm forgetting a few things. The combat itself is, again, it's essentially simplified Dark Souls combat. You know, there's a shield block, shield bash, heavy swing, light swing, that sort of thing, with different movesets and different swing speeds for different weapons, and different minor buffs on certain things, or you know, extras that you get from certain weapons. But the hitboxes can feel fairly imprecise, and all in all, it just doesn't, things don't have the same weight as they do in, you know, an RPG that feels good. And I've talked about this before, this nebulous feeling of the gameplay, you know, feeling good. The Dark Souls, amongst others, do so well, which can be related to multiple things, both the audio that comes with the swing, the particle effects, the weight behind a swing when it contacts with an enemy. That's all stuff that you can sort of interpret from what you see in front of you, and weapons don't necessarily seem to swing at the speed you would expect. Smaller weapons don't necessarily get that many more swings or swing fast enough. Heavy weapons don't always have the oomph behind them. And all in all, I mean, you can get a little bit from watching the footage here. It just doesn't have the same level of polish as some other games out there. Harebrained Schemes does have a history of putting out games and then doing fairly good support in updating them and responding to the community, so on and so forth. So I am hopeful. They're the folks who have done most or all, I'm not entirely sure, of the Shadowrun reboot games, of which I am a fan. And I am hopeful that in the coming months, they will continue to do updates. They have committed to do a few more updates, but I'm hoping that this continues as a more of an in-development situation. Again, the initial release was received with some apprehension, and they did respond and say, hey, look, we hear what you're saying, and here's what we're doing to fix it. And they have, to some extent. But as far as this being a full-fledged release, I don't know that it certainly, I don't think I'd put down the money for the full price release right now. If you see it on sale for maybe $10 or something like that, it might be worthwhile. But if they do continue to commit to doing regular updates, adding more biomes, adding more classes, which I believe they have already committed to doing, then I think there's definitely some potential there. But again, it was the original full release was the one. It wasn't a beta release. It wasn't an early access release before this. It was the full release months ago. So where they will draw the line of, hey, we can't put any more work into this, or it's no longer economically viable for us to put more work into this, that is a question there. And even if they do all those additions, something tells me that some of the more deeply seated design flaws, such as the fairly unpopulated locales and things like that will never be addressed, because that is a whole other tier of support, of updating, of that sort of thing. That's a whole other level of commitment that they would have to make. I'm not saying that they couldn't do it. I'm not saying that they won't. I'm saying that it seems to me, from an outsider's perspective, that it wouldn't be economically viable for them to do it. But I am hopeful, even then. Despite all of the complaints that I've made here, I have had a pretty good time with it, playing multiplayer. If that was not already made clear, as far as a multiplayer game goes, it's pretty fun. It has a few multiplayer problems. It also, I failed to mention that it has some issues with saving and things like that. You only get one save slot. It's not a manual save. And loading in and out of a single player versus a multiplayer game is a tenuous and questionable process as far as whether or not you will get to keep the equipment that you've been wearing if you have not yet died. You can save and quit at any time from a single player or multiplayer, but loading back in is always seems a little bit questionable. And the mechanics for that, amongst the many other things, are, like the other things, not very well explained. You sort of have to experiment to figure them out, or ask somebody who knows. So this is drawn out into a much longer video than I originally intended. I expected this to be about 6-8 minutes. So I apologize if I'm droning on too long about it. But after putting in about 6-8 hours to it, playing it through to the end, it's a game. It was a decent time. It requires a lot of work. That's sort of my be all end all for it. So yeah, I won't keep you guys any longer. Thank you again for watching. Thank you especially if you've made it to the end of this video. I have been the Social Solipsist, and I will see you guys next time.